First conference this morning is on hell. And to set the seriousness and the context of this conference, I'd like to give a quote from Sister Lucia in her memoirs, where she describes what their vision of hell was that Our Lady showed to them when they were children at Fatima. She says, quote, "She opened her hands once more, and she had done the 2 previous months. The rays of light appeared to penetrate the earth, and we saw, as it were, a vast sea of fire. Plunged in this fire, we saw the demons and the souls of the damned. The latter were like transparent burning embers, all blackened and burnished bronze, having human forms. They were floating about in that conflagration, now raised into the air by the flames which issued from within themselves, together with great clouds of smoke. Now they fell back on every side, like sparks in huge fires, without weight or equilibrium, amid shrieks and groans of pain and despair, which horrified us and made us tremble with fright. The demons were distinguished from the souls of the damned by their terrifying and repellent likeness to frightful and unknown animals. That vision only lasted for a moment, thanks to our good Heavenly Mother, who at the first apparition had promised to take us to heaven. Without that, I think that we would have died of terror and fear," unquote. In Scripture, we read in the Old Testament, in the book of Judith, that he will give fire and worms into their flesh, and they may burn and may feel forever. In the book of Job, we read that hell is a land of misery and darkness, where the shadow of death and no order but everlasting horror dwelleth. In the book of Isaiah, we read, "The nourishment there is fire and much wood. The worm shall die not, and their fire shall not be quenched." In the New Testament, our Lord said in the book of Matthew, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into the everlasting fire, which was prepared for the devils and his angels." We also read in the book of Matthew, "Every tree that yield not good fruit shall be cut down and shall be cast into fire, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." In the book of the Apocalypse, we read, "The pool of fire, where both the beast and the false prophet shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. And the smoke of their torments shall ascend up forever and ever." Scripture tells us a great deal about Satan and also about hell, despite the modern theory that there is no hell. For example, we read in the book of the Apocalypse, quote, "And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 7 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. And his tail drew their 3rd part of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And that great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, who seduceth the whole world. And he was cast into the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him." When we take a look at what the Church teaches, we know that those go to hell who die in the state of mortal sin, that is, without any sanctifying grace. By taking a look at the teachings of the Church, and also what the saints have told us, and we look at the nature of man, and we consider the nature of justice and suffering, we come to a great deal of knowledge about the nature of the sufferings in hell. The first suffering that is often talked about is what we call the pain of sense. St. Alphonsus Liguori and the other saints tell us that the suffering in hell is proportionate to the offenses committed against God. So there's actually levels in hell. Some people will suffer more than others. There are 5 exterior senses. We can suffer more intensely in hell because of the fact that the body is no longer subject to limitations of human flesh. After the resurrection of the body is qualitatively changed, and so as a result it can sustain much greater suffering. The damned fear and loathe just even the idea of the resurrection, because they know when they get their body back, their sufferings will increase. And the saints describe that in hell there is a kind of a crushing experience of those in hell, and also burning. And this fits the senses, the first sense, touch, because the first sense of touch detects pressure and temperature. Some of the saints talk about how in hell there is both a fire and also a cold, so that the souls will flip back and forth between the fire and the instantaneous freezing in order to get some relief. but there is no relief. The other thing is that this suffering isn't just on the skin, it's through the whole body. The whole body is racked with suffering. St. Bridget tells us in her Revelation that the heat of the hellfire is so great that if the whole world were wrapped in flames, the heat of the conflagration would be as nothing in comparison to the sufferings in hell. St. Vincent Ferrer tells us that the fires on earth, they are cold in comparison to the fires in hell. There is a quote from the Dreams of St. John Bosco which I think is worth reflecting on. He says, "Take a closer look," he replied. Now, he refers to the one who has brought him to this vision of hell. "I did," referring to St. John Bosco. "Traps were everywhere, some close to the ground, others at eye level, but all well concealed. Unaware of their danger, many boys got caught and they tripped. They would sprawl to the ground, legs in the air. Then when they managed to get back on their feet, they would run headlong down the road towards the abyss. Some got trapped by their head, others by their neck, hand, arms, legs, or sides, and were pulled down instantly. Yet to my surprise, every boy they snared fell to the ground. He wanted to stop, but could not. Tripping on the protruding stones, he kept falling even faster. 'Let's help him, let's stop him,' I shouted, holding out my hands in a vain effort to restrain him. 'Leave him alone,' the guide replied. 'Why? Do you not know how terrible God's vengeance is? Do you think that you can restrain one who is fleeing from his wrath?' As soon as I crossed its threshold, I felt an indescribable terror, dared not take another step. Ahead of me I could see something like an immense cave which gradually disappeared into recesses sunk far into the bowels of the mountains. They were all ablaze, but there was not an earthly fire with leaping tongues of flame. The entire cave, walls, ceilings, floors, iron, stones, wood, and coal, everything was a glowing white at temperatures of thousands of degrees. Yet the fire did not incinerate, it did not consume. I took a few steps forward and saw that many of those poor wretches were savagely striking at each other like mad dogs. Others were clawing their own faces and hands, tearing their own flesh and spitefully throwing it about. Just then the entire ceiling of the cave became as transparent as crystal and revealed a patch of heaven and their radiant companions safe for all eternity. The poor wretches, fuming and panting with envy, burned with rage because they had once ridiculed the just. Pressing my ear to the crystal window, I heard the screams, sobs, blasphemies, and imprecations against the saints. It was a tumult of voices and cries, shrill and confused. Here time is no more. Here is only eternity. Now that you have seen what others suffer, you too must experience a touch of hell. No, no, I cried in terror. He insisted, but I kept refusing. Do not be afraid, he told me. Just try it. Touch this wall. I could not muster enough courage and tried to get away, but he held me back. Try it, he insisted. Gripping my arm firmly, he pulled me to the wall. Only one touch, he commanded, so that you may say that you have seen and touched the walls of eternal suffering, and that you may understand what the last wall must be like if the first is so unendurable. Look at this wall. I did intently. It seemed incredibly thick. There are 1,000 walls between this and the real fire of hell, my guide continued. 1,000 walls encompassed it, each 1,000 measures thick, each equally distant from the next one. Each measure is 1,000 miles. This wall, therefore, is millions and millions of miles from hell's real fire. It is just a remote rim of hell itself. When he said this, I instinctively pulled back, but he seized my hand, forced it open, and pressed it against the first of the 1,000 walls. The sensation was so utterly excruciating that I leapt back with a scream and found myself sitting up in bed. My hand was stinging and I kept rubbing it to ease the pain. When I got up this morning, I noticed that it was swollen. Having my hand pressed against the wall, though only in a dream, felt so real that later the skin of my palm peeled off. This gives us an idea of how utter excruciating just the sense of touch is. And what of taste? Imagine drinking the foulest sewer water, and this is nothing compared to the taste that those who suffer in hell endure every day. And what of smell? There are certain places, if you go by certain stockyards, sometimes the smell is so bad around them, you can taste it. Well, in hell, it's worse than that. They talk about, the saints refer to sulfur and pitch. Brimstone is another name for sulfur. And there's also the smell of rotting and burning flesh in hell. St. Bonaventure says that the stench from the flesh of a single person in hell would so taint the air of the earth so as to cause the death of all living beings coming near it. And this is the stench of a single soul. What about hell in which is filled with them? What about sight? The saints talk a great deal about visions of horror. The demons, the souls of the damned, seeing their suffering, they see them. The darkness, that is, it's dark there. Because light is a sign of intelligence and purity, but there is none in hell, in the sense that there is no purity. And so the bodies of those in hell, even though they get off a kind of glow, which the saints talk about, are yet dark. They talk about the frightful appearances, the various things that they see. As to the sense of hearing, as we read in St. John Bosco and elsewhere, the saints talk about the shrill, the constant screaming, and the cries of agony and pain, and that the sounds are very fearful, because the demons themselves can cause sound. Imagine the sounds you hear when it causes your hair to stand on end, and then multiply that innumerably, and that's what it's like being in hell. Then there is in hell hunger and thirst. It is hard for us to even form an idea of how much those in hell hunger and thirst. What we experience here, even starvation in this life, is nothing compared to the hunger and the thirst of those in hell. In fact, the souls in hell would prefer earthly starvation to the hunger of hell. In Luke, we read that the dead man asks for a single drop of water to quench his thirst just for a moment. That's how much he thirsts. And those are just the exterior senses. Then we have what we call the four interior senses. And these are the four, they're called senses, but they're not senses in the sense like we sense with our hands, but rather they refer to what's called the common sense power. I'll explain that as we go along. The imagination, the cogitative power, and our memory. The common sense power is the one which takes all of the five senses that we have and unifies them and expresses that experience into our imagination so that we experience these things at the same time. So, for example, some people whose common sense power doesn't work properly, they see things and hear them at different times. They don't get sequenced into their imagination properly. Well, in hell, none of the five senses work right together. In other words, the common sense power doesn't work. The sense experience is expressed in the imagination in a confusing way, in different ways. So this causes a great deal of confusion to the damned. The demons don't have the four interior senses, they just have an intellect. And so they're not confused, which actually means that their suffering in hell is worse than ours, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So those in hell suffer confusion. Next is memory. Those in hell constantly remember their sin, because they remember the things that they did in their life, and this bothers them. That is, they remember the sins that caused their condemnation. They also remember the goods on earth which they had, but now they're gone. They have them no longer. They also remember the evil that others did to them, which causes them constant anger. And so the memory is a constant thing of torture. The demons can look into your memory, even in this life, and see the sins that you've committed and bring them into a form of temptation, which we have in this life. But in the next life, they can bring that into your imagination to torture you more. Then there is the imagination. In hell, we have no control over the images which float through our imagination. But sometimes when people are sick or when they're not well or under certain circumstances, they recognize they can't get a hold on what's going through their imagination. Well, hell is constantly like that. You have no control over your imagination. And this means also that Satan plays with those images. It's a non-stop horror. There is a dream of St. John Bosco where he sees a demon tempting or causing a dream in one of the boys at his school. And the vision has the demon sticking his finger in the head and stirring it. And in a certain sense, this is a great image, because the demons can look into your imagination and draw up from those things. This is why they always say, for the priest, the man who has been chaste, it's easier to remain chaste, because he has less material for the temptations. Whereas for the man who isn't chaste, it's much harder for him to lead a vow of chastity, because of the fact that he has all these images which Satan can make use of. He has to pray for the gift of purification of memory. But in hell, you have no control over that, and Satan will constantly bring these things into your imagination and torture you with them. Then there's what we have called the cogitative power, and that is the part of our brain which has the power of association. Even animals have this, except in animals we call it an estimative sense. And you see this even among married people, because married people, it just takes a certain while with a particular defect of one of their spouse, and all they have to do is see that, and before they can even think about it, the emotion which is associated with that activity or that behavior arises. And that's because the cogitative power can associate or make an assessment of that independently of our ability to control it at times. Now, what this means is in hell, this power of association, we have no control over it. So the demons, however, will be able to influence it and affect our associations. And so everything in hell will have the associations and assessments which draw out the worst kinds of passions, the worst kinds of emotions. Since the four interior senses are dysfunctional in hell, there is profound confusion in the person. He can't keep his thoughts recollected, he just has no control over it. This will have a direct impact on the appetitive life, that is, on our emotions. St. Thomas, along with the scholastic tradition, says that the appetites are moved by the presence of their object. And what that means is that when the object which causes specific emotions in us comes into our imagination, it causes our passions. Now, in hell, this means that whatever flows through our imagination will directly affect our emotional life. The next thing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is the emotional life, but the next thing I want to talk about is there's this, we're not finished with just the intellectual suffering yet. Because it's a great suffering for us to see others in hell and their suffering, plus our own suffering and everyone else's suffering that's going on. Plus, then when people look up in heaven, they see from time to time, they're given a vision of the other people's experience, which causes them great emotional strife. But then there is two parts to our intellect. We have a material part of our brain, or material part of us, which is the brain. But then our intellect is also immaterial, because we can actually perform immaterial functions. And one of the immaterial functions that we perform is self-reflection. No material thing is capable of bending back and looking at itself, whereas our intellect can do that. That's one of the signs that we perform spiritual operations. In addition to the will, which is also, because it's not a physical, doesn't operate through a physical organ, is why it's free. It's not constrained to the physical laws. That's why we're free. So this intellect, which we call the possible intellect, performs three functions. The first is simple apprehension, and that's when you grasp something, you can understand it. Those in hell, they cannot understand anything properly, except those evils which God would have them understand for the sake of their punishment. Because of their confusion in the lower faculties, they have a hard time understanding things. Then there is the act of judgments, because we can it's one thing to understand something, it's another thing to make a judgment by comparing it to different things. Those who are in hell cannot think clearly. They have no clear judgment except that of conscience, which we will see a little bit later. Conscience is a judgment of the possible intellect about what we've done, whether it's right or wrong, or what we're going to do, whether it could be right or wrong when we do it, or also it is the thing which nags us when we've done something wrong, or it actually makes us happy when we've done something right. One thing is clear to the person in hell, and this is his judgment is absolutely clear on one thing, that his punishment is absolutely just and proportionate to what he has done, so that he cannot deny it. In this life, it's very easy for us to deny reality. Not in hell. It's so real. And when God passes judgment on you and communicates that to you in your final judgment, it is so clear that the soul cannot deny it. We do know that we are in hell, of course, and that we are suffering, but due to the confusion, there is an inability to grasp fully everything that's going on. Whereas the demons, it's another matter. Because they don't suffer confusion, they have a perfect understanding of what's going on, which is why it's a greater suffering for them. Then there is our will. Because we used our will wrongly, that is, God gives us what we want, ultimately. If we choose evil, then that's what he gives us. He gives us the effects, and he gives us evil. So in hell, the will is full of hatred. It's incapable of love, not even itself. It can't even love itself. It has spite. It hates everyone around them. It has despair, because it knows it's never going to get freed from the suffering, because it's eternal. It has perfect malice. It wants to mete out suffering and agony to everyone around them. There is perfect ill will to everybody, and they desire to lash out at God. They have a perfect hatred of God in hell. It also makes the sufferings of those around you more intense. That is, those around you cause you suffering, and you cause them suffering. And as a result, you harbor hatred for them, and you have perfect hatred of the demons. Then we come to the appetites. Now, the appetites are faculties in us which cause the emotions. That is, they're those which the emotions arise in us. And there are 11 emotions. But in hell, there's only negative emotions. The first appetite is what we call the irascible appetite. Now, the irascible appetite in us is that which inclines us, that is, it's the one that causes anger in us. It inclines us towards overcoming difficult things, and that's what anger is ordered towards. But the irascible appetite, in the irascible appetite, there is hatred and despair. Now, here we're talking about a bodily thing, at a bodily level. So first we have it in the will, so we hate everything around us. And then at a body level, there's this constant revulsion and hatred, emotional hatred for everyone around us. And there is perfect despair. There is absolute rage and anger. The soul can't control it. In fact, it wants to be angry. Then there is perfect frustration, which is a kind of anger because it can't attain what it wants. There is perfect fear. Fear, St. Thomas defines as an emotion which arises out of the perception of an upcoming evil. Now, there's perfect fear in hell because we know for certain that it's coming. That is, the eternal suffering is always going to be there. There's always going to be a new kind of suffering around the corner, some type of humiliation and agony and pain and everything else. And so we're fearful of that all the time. There is perfect terror. And that's just in the irascible appetite. But then we have what we call the concupiscible appetite. And St. Thomas says that's the appetite that desires bodily goods, like food and conjugal relations. We know that those in hell have eternal bodily wantonness. That is, they hunger and thirst for eternity. They have uncontrolled sexual appetite. And because our appetites operate through a bodily organ, the demons can act upon them and increase them and make them stronger. One of the signs of demonic possession is when a person starts losing control over the emotional life, or they don't have control over their emotional life, or the emotions are inordinately strong contrary to their disposition. In hell, the passions are just raging and out of control and increased and strengthened by the demons around them. Then there is a desire to hurt others and an envy of those in heaven. Then we have a faculty called the motive power. It's the thing which helps us to move. We walk and things of this sort. In hell, the motive power is bound in the sense that we have no control over it. We have no control over the power of motion, and this means that there tends to be two types of things that occur to people. One, the person becomes bound, they can't move. So some of the saints will actually talk about in hell how the people become bound and they're stuck in that same position for all eternity. But then there's other souls where their limbs have no control of limbs, so they lash out at others and themselves uncontrollably. They gouge out their eyes and their flesh. But in hell, because the resurrected body can't undergo dissolution, that is, you can't kill it. That is, so as a result, it's constant. All through hell, there's this gouging that goes on with them. They hit themselves and those around them. Then there's the faculty of speech. The saints, St. Thomas asked the question whether those in hell commit blasphemy, that is, whether they commit malediction. And he says, yes, they do. And it's because they have no control over it. So they're constantly blaspheming God, His justice, the saints, those around them. They're constantly lashing out verbally against those around. Now think of the worst argument you've had with your spouse or with your closest friend. And the emotional experience you had, it's going to be far worse than that in hell. You also state words of malice against others because you have no control over your faculty of speech. You have no control over your bowels. There's constant vomiting. There's even a kind of suffocation. Part of it's because of the crushing experience that they have, but the saints also talk about it's suffocating, not only from the smell and from everything around them, but just the whole experience of it. And this is just the physical suffering. We haven't even gotten to the spiritual suffering entirely yet. One of the first spiritual sufferings is the company in hell. Just as those who go to heaven enjoy the eternal company of God, those who go to hell have the eternal company of Satan and the demonic. Each demon who successfully tempted you on earth will laugh at you, mock at you, torment you spiritually, cause you physical pain and other sufferings. They will cause you emotional pain and distress. As I mentioned, they will increase your sufferings, your confusion, your feelings of guilt, shame, and hatred. In other words, their company will be forever with you. When a person is demonically oppressed, which is different possession. Possession is when the demons take possession of your body physically and they move it about. Oppression is a different matter. Oppression is when they constantly put something into your imagination. You can't seem to get these thoughts out of your head, and there's a certain weighing down that occurs from it. Those who experience demonic oppression, I've talked to priests who have been in buildings where the demonic influence is very powerful. They walk in and immediately sense this oppression. This is how it is in hell, except it's far worse, because in this life, God restricts how much the demons can affect us and influence us, but not in hell. There is no freedom in hell. And you can't get away from it. You can't get away from the demonic. You can't get away from anything. You can't get away from anybody. Then they also obsess you. That is, they affect your psychological faculties so that you become fixated at one moment on something, and then the next you're fleeting to the next. Plus, each demon has its own personality. like for instance, if you read the lives of the saints and they've had visions of angels, talk about how distinct each personality of the angels are. And those who do possessions, that is, the exorcists who exorcise demons, talk about how completely distinct each demon is. And once you find out what his personality is, you know his name, and that's how you kick him out. But in hell, this personality means that the demons, each personality that they have afflicts you. Now, I'm sure you've been around people whose personality just rubs you the wrong way. The minute you just see them walking down, it's just instant suffering. It's like, oh, here they come. Well, guess what? It's like that, but everybody around you is like that in hell. They will terrorize the soul in different ways based upon each personality of the demon and what they know bothers you the most. There is a hierarchy of demons in hell, and this causes us a certain fear, because even though certain demons around us might be bothering us, we know that there's always a higher one, and this Satan is the one actually doing it. There is also different severities of punishment. Even the demons fear those who have power over them. So one of the things that exorcists will talk about is how the one demon, when he's getting kicked out, he doesn't want to leave, because demons actually prefer to be acting in this life because it gets them a distraction, a certain distraction from having to deal with the constant suffering that's going on in hell. Plus, there's a hierarchy. So, and God respects hierarchies, and even the people in hell have to respect the hierarchies. So very often God will allow someone to become possessed, but the one who gives the command to do it may be a higher demon telling a lower demon to do it. Which means that when the demon gets kicked out, the higher demon gets raged at the other demon for not doing enough or not doing his job. Well, in hell, it's somewhat the same way. There's always a higher demon who's going to be ordering you to be suffering under the hands of other demons. Just the sight of the demonic causes revulsion and fright. St. Anthony relates that one of the brothers of his order uttered a piercing scream at the sight of a devil who appeared to him. His fellow monks, running to him in alarm, found him more dead than alive. After giving him something to revive and strengthen him, they asked him what was the matter. Then he told them that the devil had appeared to him and terrified him so that all the life had gone out of him. And on their inquiring what the devil looked like, he answered, that I really cannot say. I can only say that if the choice were given me, I would rather be put into a red-hot furnace than to look again at the countenance of the demon. We read much more the same thing in the life of St. Catherine of Siena. She too declared that she would rather walk through a flaming fire than gaze for one instant at the devil. When we consider the malice of people like Hitler, Mao, and Stalin and the like, these taken together and multiplied 100-fold does not even equal the malice of Satan. And that malice will find its full effects on you if you are in hell. Those in hell would gladly take the place of the prisoners in Auschwitz, the gulags, 100 times over, than to be in hell and suffer the malice of Satan, the demons, and everyone else there. Everyone around you in hell hates you. Nobody loves you. Not your parents, not your children, not your spouse, not your guardian angel, the saints, or God. Nobody. Even in this life, if we sense that someone does not like us, we at least know that someone loves us, but not in hell. You're totally cut off from love and the effects of love. Now, God loves your human nature still, but the effects of His love are totally cut off from you. Nobody can stand you. You are a foul wretch, something completely unworthy of love. St. Thomas says that the sins of the reprobate are known to each other. Part of this is because they see Him at the final judgment. This causes shame and embarrassment to the souls, and as a result they become objects of scorn and derision, but also disgust at seeing the sins of others and seeing their punishments as a result of their sins. In hell, there is no truth, except that which comes from your punishment. Everybody lies to you, except when the truth will cause you more suffering. You have no control over yourself. but they have absolute control over you. You do their every bidding and whim, regardless of how disgusting, revulsive, vile, or evil. And then there is the suffering that comes from God and his wrath and his justice. This will haunt you the entire time you are in hell. You shall in horror flee his justice from all eternity, but you shall never escape it. Your hatred for God and his justice shall consume you. There is a story of a soul that appeared to a saint, and the soul was in purgatory, and it was suffering tremendously. And the saint asked him, "Wouldn't you like to be in heaven?" And he said, "No." He said, "I would rather spend an eternity in purgatory than a single instance in the sight of God with a single blemish on my soul." And yet, the souls in hell, being darkened and impure from top to bottom, know that God looks at them and sees them and has utter contempt for them. Then there is what we call the pain of separation, which is opposed to the pain of sense. For all eternity, you will never see God, and you will never experience heaven. When you die and you go before God, the fact that you need him to be happy and to have any fulfillment whatsoever is made absolutely clear to you, and then you're placed in hell. It's like taking the closest person you've ever been in this life, knowing that they're going to be stripped from you and you're never going to be seeing them again. The evil one himself was made to acknowledge this, as we read in the legends of Blessed Jordan, at one time general of the Dominican order. For when Jordan asked Satan, in the person of one who was possessed, what was the principal torment of hell, he answered, being excluded from the presence of God. Is God then so beautiful to look upon? Jordan inquired. And the devil replied that he was indeed most beautiful. Lie asked further, how great is his beauty? Look, fool that thou art, was the rejoinder, to put such a question to me. Dost thou know that his beauty is beyond compare? Canst thou not suggest divine beauty? Then Satan said, imagine a crystal sphere 1,000 times more brilliant than the sun, in which the loveliness of all of the colors of the rainbow, the fragrance of every flower, the sweetness of every delicious flavor, the costliness of every precious stone, the kindliness of men, and the attractiveness of all the angels combined. Fair and precious as this crystal would be in comparison with the divine beauty, it would be unsightly and impure. And pray, the good monk inquired, what wouldst thou give to be admitted to the vision of God? And the devil replied, if there were a pillar reaching from earth to heaven, beset with sharp points and nails and hooks, I would gladly consent to be dragged up and down that pillar from now until the day of judgment, if I could only be permitted to gaze on the divine countenance for a few brief moments. St. John Chrysostom says that the torments of 1,000 hells are nothing in comparison to the anguish of being banished from the everlasting bliss and the vision of God. In other words, all of the pains of sense, which we talked about before, is nothing in comparison to the pain of loss. St. Thomas Aquinas says that the punishment of the damned is infinite because they have suffered the loss of the infinite good, that is God. Yet the damned will curse God for having created them, redeemed them, for his mercy and for his goodness, which they experience not. The sufferings in hell are so great that the souls there would prefer annihilation, that is, to go out of existence, than to suffer them. Yet these sufferings for the reprobate are eternal and unchangeable. They will never end, causing perpetual fear and despair among the damned. The Church teaches that those who go to hell because they die in the state of mortal sin, as we have mentioned, and those who are not repentant of their sins, there is a place in hell for you already. If you don't do something about your life, you may end up there. St. Teresa of Avila, one of the greatest mystics in the history of the world, saw her place in hell. She saw it, recognizing that if she does not do everything she can to save her soul, she could end up there as well. all it takes is a single, fully entertained, that is fully volitional, impure thought, and that's your eternal punishment. That's what you're worthy of. Therefore, avoid mortal sin, die in the state of grace, otherwise the place in hell with your name on it will find its occupant. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.